What do you grow in the summer? Like if you're craving something that is difficult.
So variety selection is certainly important. Also, alternative crops in general. I'm going to really struggle to meet my zucchini needs here in Florida. So if I want that same textural experience eating wise, I can just grow a loofah gourd or other kinds of edible gourds like the cucuzza gourd. These gourds, they fare really well in our heat and humidity. They can take the summer. They're beautiful vining crops. And when you eat those fruit young enough, they're unmistakable from a zucchini. Just swapping out the crop entirely is sometimes the answer down here in an extreme climate.
Welcome to the Beet podcast. I'm your host today, Jacques, aka the Garden Hermit, and today we have a very exciting guest on, somebody that we've worked with before. I still have yet to meet you in person, and I'm very much looking forward to that. But it is Shannie. You might have seen her in a lot of our videos lately. She's been a really great contributor and has a really unique, interesting lens in the world of gardening. So thanks for coming on. And why don't you give us a little background about yourself and what kind of gardener you are?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be on. I'm actually a long-time listener, first-time contributor. I really
Nice.
I really love the Beet podcast, and it has accompanied me on many gardening moments. Yes, so my name's Shannie McCabe. I am a Zone 9B 10A. I really actually do say both because we were actually just upgraded to a 10A gardener
Right.
in Central Florida. I've been growing for 15 years. For the better part of that, it's been in the professional space. I attended, I've been a professional horticulturist, mostly growing edible veggies. Vegetable farming, organic vegetable farming has been my passion. And that was
Very
what
cool.
that's what I focused on. I did go to the University of Rhode Island. That's where I'm from, born and raised. Actually, I grew up on a small island off the coast of Rhode Island called Block Island. I actually had to take an hour-long ferry to get to my hometown. It was a
Wow.
it was a really unique.
That's really cool.
Yeah, there was only 800 year-round residents. I grew up on a farm. It was agritourism. I actually used to take people on horseback, tourists on horseback guided rides, which is definitely where I honed my public speaking skills. And we did grow some veggies on our farm as well, but that was just for personal consumption. The reason that I bring up that I grew up on an island off the coast of Rhode Island is that I'm not a stranger to growing in pretty extreme climates. It was a
Yeah, that is a unique environment to be growing in.
we were 15 miles off the coast of Rhode Island, so we were up in the North Atlantic, and the weather was harsh.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
we had beautiful summers, but gardening was a really fun and interesting challenge there, and that's sort of where I got my start. I then went on to the University of Rhode Island, where I got a bachelor's of environmental horticulture with a focus in sustainable agriculture. And I was really into veggie farming. That was like my jam. I just thought it was just so exciting to grow my own veggies. Growing up on a small island, I actually didn't get to eat a lot of produce because it was really expensive to get shipped in over on the ferry. So we kind of
man, I believe
ate
it.
yeah, I was sort of raised on like a World War II bunker diet because everything had to get shipped over. So you'd grow some veggies in your short little summer window up in New England, but for the most part, like I never had an artichoke until I went off to college, which is very different for you guys in California. You guys like live and breathe artichokes, but I had
It's
never
so
had
funny
one.
you mentioned that one because I remember reading Elliot Coleman's book about like the New Organic Gardener. I actually just told this story, but he had this like paragraph where he was bragging because he's like, I figured out how to grow artichokes in Maine. So take that, California.
That actually is an incredible feat. Yeah, you have to trick them. You have like
Yeah.
there's garden trickery. You have to literally make them believe
Yeah,
that.
bamboozling.
Yeah. So I was just like totally blown away by the grow your own food revolution. And so I studied horticulture. I was just obsessed with plants. My classes that I studied were things that I still pull from to this day because I had really passionate, amazing professors. I loved my plant physiology class where I learned about, all the mechanics of how the biology of a plant actually works, breaking down photosynthesis and transpiration and all the different biological behaviors of our plants and why they act the way they do, and how that plays into the applied science of gardening, how the science behind why we do what we do as gardeners and just the daily acts. And I really loved my pest and diseases classes. I had a plant pathology professor who was like older and really super passionate. And I was just like front and center. Like I loved every moment learning about pests, diseases, plant physiology, propagation. It was just, I ate it all up. I was like just so into the course. It was tons of fun. So then I graduated and I moved on to managing a few different organic vegetable farms. I worked on an cut your own flower farm, managing production there, which was tons of fun. Cool. And I'd always had my own home garden over the summer when I was in college. So I love small scale backyard gardening is actually really my passion. Farming is a ton of fun, but I have kind of equal love for both. And so I went on to work for just shy of a decade for the country's largest, what would go on to become the country's largest heirloom seed company. It was out in the Missouri Ozarks. And I started off as a co-farm manager on that farm. And it was a ton of fun because I grew essentially an encyclopedia of plants. My job was to co-manage.
Oh, yeah. That'd be super cool to learn how to grow all these different, like, unique, interesting plants. Man, already, such a breadth of different experiences that you built up.
Yes, it was a ton of fun. I did get the opportunity I had to grow one of everything and trial. So that was super cool, just to spread it out and see a little sampling of everything and try to coerce certain things to grow in the Missouri Ozarks that really didn't want to, which was fun and an interesting challenge as well. I traveled internationally for that job, finding new varieties, connecting with growers. I ended up in the tulip region of the Netherlands and the Peruvian Amazon and everywhere in between. I had a ton of fun traveling and just really it was really encyclopedic is what I have to say. It was like 10 years of really learning what there is to grow, especially in the edible plant realm. And so that was super, super cool. And I sort of pivoted during that time that I worked for the company. I pivoted from managing gardens to more making video and mostly video and written content. I wrote seed catalogs and made I made a lot of video content. And that was all based on how to grow these things because we offered such a breadth of variety. It could be challenging sometimes to help the customer to bring it home and figure out how to grow it in their backyard. So I would kind of bridge that gap, growing in the trial gardens, figuring out how something would really thrive, and then bringing that information to our viewers or our customers, what have you. And so that's where I really got...
because they also have weird, when do you harvest this? It looks totally foreign to me. I've never seen this. So yeah, it's very interesting to develop all of that information.
Yeah, exploring, and we did a lot of work in the kitchen as well. So we would also be figuring out how do we eat these things because they're not something that's rare to someone, very familiar to someone else, but new to me and maybe new to the readers of the catalog. So that was sort of my journey, my trajectory, sort of meandering from farm management to kind of exploration, trialing, learning about new things, and then bringing that breadth of knowledge to our viewers and sort of learning how to relay that on video. And that's where I came to epic gardening.
That's awesome. Let's dive in a little bit to some stuff. Growing up on an island, first of all, in the Atlantic. Yeah, severe storms, probably very cold on the coast there, literally surrounded by coast. I doubt, could you guys even grow tomatoes up there in the coast? I guess you probably could.
So we grow beautiful tomatoes, but they're really not ready until July, late July, unless you have a greenhouse. Okay. So we can grow tomatoes. And what I always thought was so cool, and I feel like with your geology degree, you're going to find this interesting as well. So the island I grew up on was only 14 miles located off the coast of Rhode Island. And mainland Rhode Island, which is part of New England, it is a continental climate. So pretty harsh winters,
Right.
harsh winters,
Extreme summer.
mild to pretty hot summers. And I was just 14 miles off, but actually our climate was classified as as closer to the UK than to the climate 14 miles back on the coast. So just because we were surrounded by the ocean, it gave us a slight buffer. So we had extreme storms and we had some real cold in the winter, but our fall was very, very mild until the bitter end. And then our springs were pretty cold. So we were classified closer to the UK than we were 14 miles away on the right there on the continent. So I always thought that was interesting. And I would say a lot of growers there did like to pull from sort of like that British cottage gardening look. And growing up, my hometown was always compared to Ireland because it did look a lot like Ireland.
Oh, that's very cool. And actually, like speaking, like, so yeah, I have my background is in geology. I have my geology degree. And now that I'm like deep into gardening and this world, part of me always wishes that like I did have some sort of horticultural degree. And I'm actually curious, since you do have one, do you actually like, do you look at things in the garden in a different lens? Like, when you see a problem on a plant, are you really thinking about it on like down to like the structural level of how the plant is growing? Or are you mostly kind of like, I understand what's happening, but the treatments are still the same? Like, are you just thinking about things a little bit more deeply, or do you approach things a little bit differently as well?
That's a great question. So it's got to be both, because there are times when I'll look at a problem and I'll think about it from the plant physiology perspective and say, if someone sends me a picture of their damaged tomato, I can look and say, I see cell death on that leaf. Because I kind of know how a plant cell would look, and so, oh, look, it's collapsed. It's probably got cold damage because the water inside that plant cell burst and exploded, and now it's looking kind of like deflated and watery. So that would be like, that's probably plant physiology class coming in, or probably my pest and diseases classes. It would be the same. Like if I see damage on a plant, I'm going to go, oh, that's a chewing damage on my plant. I know that's a chewing mouth part. That's probably Lepidoptera. That's a caterpillar, depending on, maybe judging by the size of the mouth part. Or that's stippling. That's an insect that is putting a sucker type mouth part into the leaf. So that would all be tracing back to my classes. But then I also did just have a lot of field experience where a lot of, especially regional advice would come across my path. Oh, well, we always preventatively track the migration of this insect because it always comes through this time of year. And I didn't learn that at school. I learned that from locals. Yeah.
You have to just learn it on the spot, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it is really interesting to think about, like looking at leaf damage. I often will look at the garden, I'm like, something's eating this leaf, but there's a couple of things. Like, I guess sometimes I'm like, whatever. If it's not a big problem, I don't actually care. Like, go for it. If you want to eat a couple leaves, like, no big deal. If like all of one type of plant is getting severely affected, that's when I start really paying attention.
Yep.
Like, I think if I had that background though, I would be more curiously like following up to try to like test that. Like, oh, I see like that this leaf is being munched. Like, it's probably a caterpillar. I'm going to look around for it. But now, like, through my lens, I'm just like, is it a major problem? No, I'm going to just walk away. But it is really fun to think about those connections and how deep you could go with it.
Oh, yeah. Biological science versus applied science, basically. And I would, sometimes you learn about something and you can't let it go. I really got so stoked when I learned how to identify. This is so silly, but I learned that there are a bunch of different grubs. When you pull them from the soil, they all look pretty much identical, little milky white grubs, right? But they have something.
Oh my God, yes.
They have something called a raster pattern, which is a little pattern, a distinct pattern that the grub will have of a hair pattern on their rear end. It's basically all these little grubs look the same to the untrained eye, but to me, I look and I can actually read their butt hair, and it's telling me that there is what type of grub it is by the pattern of the hair on its rear end. And I have never since
That's an amazing party trick.
since 2008 when I took that class, or 2012, whatever it was, I can't pick up a grub without being like, oh yeah, Japanese beetle. Because it's just like, it's so, those things you can't let go. And to your point, yes, sometimes I have to like reel it in and be like, you don't need to treat this pest. It's not actually a problem. You're just trained to be like looking at it, and you get inquisitive. But
Yeah. Well, do you want me to tell you my favorite pest is in the pest that I hate the most in my garden?
Yes.
It is the leaf-footed bug. That is my personal least favorite. I think it's a type of stink beetle.
It's stink bug, I think.
But man, they love stabbing my tomatoes. They absolutely love it. I'll see them all over my tomatoes. They cluster on them. Their babies hatched, covered.
Oh,
and right now,
yes.
they're everywhere. And then I figured out they could fly. I'm like, you're just like a worse version of a stink beetle. Like now you're flying away from me. I can't even get you.
That's terrible.
That's my mortal enemy here in San Diego.
And what does the damage look like from a leaf-footed bug?
It is like the stippling, I think. It's like you get these little dots on the tomato and they'll turn yellow. It'll sunken in because they're like pulling the moisture out. Somebody told me, which now I'm a little bit scared of, but apparently they absolutely destroy pomegranates. And I have my first pomegranates that I've ever had this year.
Wow.
And now I'm like, I need to bag those because like I can't risk losing my pomegranates because it's just too hard. Like something like that. Like this is one of those things where I really do hate this pest, but to eradicate it would require me to just like apply some sort of spray poison everywhere. I can't really get around it. So I just hand pick them when I see them. I try to squish them. But anything more than that to me isn't worth it because then I'm going to just kill a whole bunch of other stuff that I don't necessarily need to kill. So for now, I'm coping. But that's my least favorite one for sure.
Yeah, you in practice, you're talking about integrated pest management. You're basically talking about like you have to view it from the lens of do I need to treat this? I might not actually need to treat this. And sort of choosing your battles is important. Down here in Florida, we have this issue as well where there are pests and certain types of weeds that you might just going to have to be hand pulling them or putting a physical barrier around that fruit that you really want because the alternative just simply does not exist, which is wild, but a fact of life.
Yeah, it is true. And I'm actually thinking of another pest right now, which is a plant. And it's actually my euphorbia tree because I was right before we got on, I accidentally knocked into one of my euphorbia plants and it sprayed latex into my eye. But you know, that's just life. I can't eradicate it because it's too beautiful to get rid of.
I
so
know.
I am keeping it even though now my eye is dying. So that's just like part of gardening, right?
It's such a cool plant. It's developed such a cool mechanism, but you definitely ended up on the wrong end of that one.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate. That latex sap is brilliant.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Like for the plant, like fantastic.
Yes.
For my eyeball, not so much, which is its goal, I guess. But the other cool thing that you remember, so you started gardening on like an island, like the English Isles, let's say. Then from there, you went mainland, and then you went into the continent to somewhere very notoriously hot and humid, somewhere like Missouri. How was that? Like, was that a big shock to you gardening wise? Like, was there a big adaptation that you had to undergo from like what you are used to experiencing to what you are now experiencing?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
How was it?
Yeah, major culture shock on literally every level. There's a huge Amish community in that area too. I was so over the moon to make friends with Amish people, and I did crack the code, and I got awesome recipes and awesome gardening tips from Amish folks. So that's just like a side cultural note. But yes, environmentally, garden-wise, huge learning curve. It was far more humid. I mean, we had this great breeze in my hometown and in southern Rhode Island that would blow everything away. So humidity, pest pressure. I didn't have pests. When you have
all
to
the
deal,
palms are blown away.
yeah, when you have to deal with extreme cold in New England, the benefit is it kills off a lot of the pests over the winter. So really low pest pressure up there, relatively. Someone in New England is listening and getting like, what? But it's true. Sorry, it's true. um, but relatively, I live in Florida now. You have to understand. Now, compared to Florida, New England has like almost nothing. Interior New England's pretty bad. But anyways, I digress. Yeah, the Missouri Ozarks were insanely humid, insanely hot summers, and it was hard for me to wrap my mind around how they could possibly have both extremely cold winters and extremely hot summers. I was like, this feels unfair.
Yeah, that seems like a bad deal there.
But the spring a totally redemptive season in Missouri is the spring. The spring it would just burst forth with color and life. Also, they can grow pawpaws and persimmons in Missouri, which that wild foraging was like the mushroom foraging, the pawpaws, the persimmons, amazing. They grew beautiful watermelons in the boot heel of Missouri. They had little niche crops that were absolutely fantastic. There was once a booming tomato industry in the Missouri Ozarks. So they had their crops that had their window of utter perfection. But it was just, cool. Yeah, it was just not so black and white. It wasn't like easy winters, hard summers. It was more like you got to nail this window. And that would kind of prepare me for even more extreme down here in Florida, because it's just kind of that on steroids as far as humidity, heat, and pest and disease pressure go. It was like my primer.
Plus, yeah, because like you're also probably going from quite good soil to like Florida soil. And I don't know where you are in Florida, but my understanding is that it can be a little bit tricky to find good soil or stuff that isn't sand.
Yes, I actually did not live in the part of Missouri that had that like beautiful, deep, rich black loam. That does exist in Missouri, but it was a few hours north of me, and we lived in the rockiest. It was incredible. It was just one big old rock patch. So moving to Florida was actually a relief, because actually it's pretty hard to find a rock. I like never find rocks when I'm digging, which is...
Yeah, I guess that's true, because it's like a coral landmass basically for the most part.
Yes, and so where we are in Central Florida, it's sugar sand, and so water retention is quite difficult here. You have to seriously amend with organic matter constantly. A lot of people just pivot to raised beds because of that problem. That
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so sand, it comes down, and I'm so stoked to be able to talk to you about this, because like I actually only got one soil science class in college. Since then they've added more, but I got one very general soil science class that I was taking alongside like engineers and anyone who needed it for general credit.
In that ballpark.
It wasn't horticulture centered. So I've learned more of my soil science on the go. Shout out to Jeff Lowenfels, because he writes the best books about soil science. But anywho, nice. What I've learned is that the particle size of sand is so large that it doesn't have great cation exchange capacity. So it's not picking up. It's not what? So clay is extreme on the cation exchange capacity, and then sand is on the other end of the extreme, where it just doesn't hold on to nutrients well, is the best way to say it. So sandy soil has a problem with water retention and with nutrient retention. This is why we have major fertilizer runoff issues in Florida, because we're overdoing it with fertilizer, and it's running right into the water table, and overdoing it with herbicide too. So
yes.
That was quite a learning curve for me in Florida. And many people raise bed garden.
Yeah, I get it. Like I could do a quick little explanation for anyone who's curious listening about the different basic soil spectrum. But when you have a bunch of sand, it's like having a bunch of balls that when you stack them together, there's always space in between. So when water comes through, there's no blockage. The water can just go straight through that sand all the way down until it hits some other layer, or it hits water and then it collects there. The other thing, like the cation exchange, is like, it's kind of, I believe it's the literal charged surfaces on your soil. So something like clay, they're like sheet minerals, and they stick together because of their opposite charges, which makes them very sticky, and why it's hard for water to pass through that. They'll literally create impermeable sheets. So if you have a mix of that and silt with your sand, then you're able to retain some water, but still let the water through because there's still some sand. And then those charges on the clay will grab onto things that are like your phosphorus or your nitrogen because they could be charged particles. And then that could then be used to feed your plants. So if you're working in soil and you add water, it's mostly going to run straight down. If you're working with clay and you add water, it'll work slowly and spread.
Yeah.
And if you add fertilizer to sand, it'll just go straight through. And then if you add fertilizer to clay soil, it'll kind of like take a while to work its way through. So it is like an entirely different approach. And it's also one of those things where like when somebody asks you, I'm sure you get this question too, it's like, how much do I water my plants? I'm like, well, what time of year is it?
Yep.
What's your weather like? What's your soil type? Do you have mulch? What is the plant? There's so many things that go into it. And honestly, it's kind of a fun part of it because there isn't a blanket answer and you kind of just have to go out there and experience your garden and just kind of figure out like at some point, maybe the first year you're overwater, next year you're underwater, and you start to find a little equilibrium. But it's like, I'm just saying this to not get discouraged and to know that they're like watering and fertilizer. A lot of it has to do on your soil and just kind of working with it, you'll figure it out over time. So I think that's like super interesting.
That's such a good point. I always find myself saying the same thing, that this plant loves loose, well-drained soil with plenty of organic matter.
Yeah,
and I feel like I say that every time, but it's good general advice. It's the direction you want to be driving your car in, is loose, as in, you know, it's not compacted, it's not clay, it's well drained, but it has some organic matter to retain that moisture and those nutrients. And that's just sort of the most concise way to say it. Nobody's perfect, except maybe people in Iowa, but other than those lucky Iowans, the rest of us are kind of just working in that direction and also looking to alternative plants that are a little more like forgiving.
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting one too, because man, there's like a lot we could get into, but just thinking about like the soil and the climate alone, like you're essentially in the exact same zone as me. And I'm here in San Diego, you're in Florida, I'm 10B, it sounds like you're like 9B to 10A.
Mm-hmm.
So like we're basically the same. And if you were to open like an old school, like if you were to look up like, can this plant grow here? It'll be like, yes, it grows in zone 9. But that doesn't really mean anything, right? Like it's in my zone 10, like right now, today, it's like 76 degrees and it's like not very humid. On Sunday, which was a weird day, it was 103 degrees. But that's like a really wild, like random thing. Like most, like from September, like, all right, I'll say October on, we'll be in the low 70s until like December, it'll get to the 60s. But in the summertime, we generally sit around 80s. Whereas for you, like, I don't know where Florida, like, I don't know if you guys even cool down at night. Like we do.
Don't. We do not.
And so the other thing is like, for example, my tomato season is from March to November. And what is your tomato season?
Yeah, that's a great example. Our tomato season is not then. Our tomato season, it's we have two tomato seasons. They're shoulder seasons, and you must not try to work around these seasons. There's one in the fall and one in the spring. And the one in the fall, you want to get your tomatoes seeds started indoors in a protected area in around August. It's just like the way that a New England gardener has to protect in the spring from the cold. We have to protect from the summer in the heat. So in August indoors or in a protected area, we start our tomato seeds and then transplant them out with a hope of harvesting tomatoes in the fall. And those are my favorite tomatoes, especially now that winters are getting more mild in Florida. We don't have to be so concerned about getting killed off by cold. It does happen, but you'll get tomatoes pretty far into the fall, depending on what part of Florida you're in. And then over the winter, when that random frost comes through, it'll probably take out your tomatoes. And then you resume tomatoes one more time in the spring. And oh my gosh, I'm trying to remember. I feel like I do start them in March, but they're done way before you guys. I mean, would be like March and then April, May, and by June, things are not happy anymore. So spring is a shorter window. And I've really learned from living in Florida that you do need to be much more cognizant of the heat and humidity than you do of the cold. The cold will come through, but it's not guaranteed depending on where you live in Florida. And it tends to be the lesser damaging element here. But heat and humidity, it's just mind-blowing. I mean, even growing hot peppers in the summer here is challenging. That's how hot it is, that even hot peppers are like, ooh, getting uncomfortable.
Oh, well, to give you another example, okra barely does anything here. I have had okra in my garden now. I plant it every year because you never know if it's going to be like an extra hot year or not. But I've had it literally growing now for 3 months, and it's only like 2 feet tall. And it's produced like I think each plant's given me like 4 pods. Whereas probably where you're at, in 3 months, it would be like 8 feet tall.
Yes.
And it's just like branching all over the place and just raining okra.
Yeah, I would say the biggest challenge.
It's just very different.
Yeah, the biggest challenge with okra is to just harvest it in time. I mean, that's the only challenge. I mean, it grows like a weed here, very thick, very happy. And it's more like, how many pods can I possibly pick before I forget or get overwhelmed, or like my freezer overfloweth with okra and I just have to stop picking. But that's the only challenge with okra here. That is, yeah. And growing up in New England, I never had okra in my life. I tried it once to grow, and it was unhappy. So you have to grow things
even
where
peppers
they're
for
happy.
Us can suck.
Yeah, that's really, I would not expect that.
It kind of depends on, like, San Diego's interesting because I think we have like the most farms per county than anywhere else in the country.
Oh.
And there's a lot of different like microclimates. So closer to the coast could be quite cool, and you could pull off a lot of things. If you go inland, even just like 5 miles from the coast, you're looking at 90s to 70s at night. And you could grow a lot of really great peppers, a lot of really great, any summer crop, basically, melons, all things like that. I'm kind of like in between the two. So some years I could pull off some hot climate stuff. Some years they just don't do anything. Like last year, my pepper harvest was pathetic. And it didn't even start until like late August, which was like crazy. I was like, what the heck?
That's
tomatoes
incredible.
are pretty reliable where I'm at, and they pretty much always do well. I have a freezer absolutely loaded with tomatoes right now. So
I'm jealous.
And it is a different world. And like thinking of that, like, for example, you mentioned a little bit that you were thinking like sometimes you have to choose different varieties. One of the things I've started to do because of this kind of weird zone that I'm in is that I'll look for varieties that say they do well in northern regions, like quicker seasons, because our heat, it's like it doesn't get cold here, but it doesn't get that hot. So like a melon, if you don't have like 100% full sun area, it's just like not going to be very happy. So I've been trying to select a little bit towards quicker days to maturity varieties, and ones that are listed as does well in like northern climates or something like that. And I still can't say if that's working for me or not yet, but it's one of the things that I'm like trying out. But for you, like what do you grow in the summer? Like if you're craving something that is difficult.
So variety selection is certainly important. We have some great regionally adapted heirlooms and hybrids for our region, which really, really helps with not only heat and humidity, but pest and diseases. Also,
diseases are probably big.
They're really big here. Also, alternative crops in general. So here's a great one. I'm going to really struggle to meet my zucchini needs here in Florida. It is really hard to grow zucchinis, like cucurbita pepo. It's a real challenge.
I never thought of that.
Yeah, but so if I want that same textural experience eating wise, I can just grow a loofah gourd, because loofah gourd grows so beautifully here, or other kinds of edible gourds like the kukuza gourd. These gourds, they fare really well in our heat and humidity. They can take the summer. They can take anything, honestly. They're beautiful vining crops. And when you eat those fruit young enough, they're unmistakable from a zucchini. I put them in zucchini bread and fry them and latkes and whatever you want to make. It's a perfect one-to-one substitute. So just swapping out the crop entirely is sometimes the answer down here in an extreme climate. And I sort of love to frame it like I'll think, I sort of break down my gardening and my culinary needs kind of by botanical classification. Like I'll say like, I need roots, leaves, shoots, fruit. And I need heat alternative versions of all of these if I'm going to grow over the summer and actually eat out of my garden and eat local.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting.
I'm not.
Cuckoo's is one I've had, and it is good. I will recommend that one. It's a zucchini, basically harvested raw or harvested young before it has any of those seeds, and it's nice and creamy. Cooks great with like tomato sauces. Great option.
Do you like loofah?
I haven't tried the loofah. I told Kevin, I was like, Kevin's loofah was exploding this year. Mm-hmm. I was like, we got to eat one of these. And we just never got around to it. I don't know if they're still setting, but do you harvest them like almost immediately after they're pollinated, or what's the deal for eating it young?
It's not as much about length as it is about width. The skinnier, the more tender, the better. So just catch them when they're like, I mean, I would say like an inch and under is fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can let them
pretty small. Okay.
Yeah, yep. Don't let them get too big. They'll be fibrous. And, the loofah was historically used as like literally engine filters in like World War I parts. So like it's an incredibly fibrous fruit. Yeah, if you let it go too far. But yeah, I'll sort of, that's kind of the way I've reframed my kitchen garden mindset in somewhere with such an extreme climate where even a hot pepper is unhappy in the summer. I have to grow totally different crops. So you're thinking, we call it an Irish potato, but it's a Peruvian potato, but the traditional white potato we think of.
Right.
That's not happening in a summer in Florida. But there's a crop called yucca, which I believe I talked about in Epic Gardening video. Yucca, amazing, loves the heat, grows like nothing here, arguably a better texture than a potato. Come at me if you disagree. I'll die on that hill. I love it.
I've had a lot of really good yucca. I love potatoes, but yucca fries are actually really good. And yucca chips, yucca mash, it's all delicious.
Absolutely.
And it's easy to propagate, right? Because you could just break off a chunk of the root, or is it a part of the plant or the root? I can't remember.
It's just the stem. Okay. You just take a piece of the stem and literally throw it at a 45-degree angle in the soil, and it goes. So yeah, that's so cool. Like I'm replacing my roots. I have a nopales cactus, a prickly pear cactus in my backyard.
Oh yeah.
I first found that thing and I was like, oh, cactus, we're gonna have to dig that thing out. And then I was like, you know what? We're just gonna start eating that. And I have found nopales cactus when you scrape the thorns, and mine was actually a thornless variety. When you scrape the thorns of a nopales cactus paddle and you dice it up and you steam it, it is a perfect one-for-one substitute for green peppers in a recipe. And of course, you can find traditional nopales recipes anywhere. It's a really important Mexican vegetable. But if you're in Florida and you're like, man, I miss my peppers in my recipe, and diced peppers, just throw nopales in. It's a one-for-one sub. It's amazing.
That is a really interesting one. Yeah. And that one is similar for me, like okra. Like I like okra. Nopales for me, the gelatinousness sometimes is a little bit much. I know you could like cook it out and use some acid, but it's still like I could totally see it being like a green pepper roasted like on a taco. I don't think I would even think to distinguish them really.
Yeah, it is. They're pretty close, but you're right. They have that slight mucilage. I always remind myself that mucilage quality is actually great for your gut. So
yeah, I'm sure it's very healthy. Yeah,
it is. It's like, think of it like chia seeds, and then we have a whole host of heat tolerant greens that we grow here in Florida because stars have to align. You have to say your prayers, and still you may just have your spinach like immediately bolt. And I'm using the colloquial name spinach, European style spinach, because what you'll learn, especially when you grow in an incredibly beautifully diverse place like Florida, is that across the globe, there are so many different plants that are nicknamed spinach, and they don't belong to the European type spinach, to that genus and species. So we grow tropical spinaches here in Florida, and there is a huge range, and they really range from fantastic, amazing to slightly slimy. And I never want to yuck anyone's yum, because longevity spinach, maybe I'm looking at you, you're a little bit on the slimy side. I know that there are fantastic preparations and that there are many different recipes and cultures that know how to care for that plant just right and treat it well in a recipe to make it really, really sing. But me, with my background, I don't have a lot of background growing longevity spinach, so that one I struggle with. However, something like edible leaf hibiscus, which is related to okra, so it thrives down in Florida here in the super heat. It's a tropical spinach. That one is a perennial tropical, very popular in Fiji and in the Pacific Islands.
I don't think I've ever even heard of that.
It's a fantastic plant. It can take supreme heat and humidity, but also I found it can be pretty drought tolerant too. Like I've forgotten to hook my irrigation up around that plant and it did just fine. So that's a really versatile
nice
tropical green, and the texture, most importantly, the texture and the flavor are spot on. It's a lot of experimenting down here in Florida. And there's quite a hive mind that you'll access as you grow in an extreme climate. I would say this is probably true for gardening in any extreme climate, is that you really have to rely on your friends, your neighbors, your gardening pals, and that community. There are a lot of niche Facebook groups down here in Florida, like, Florida Food Forest, and people that are sharing their troubleshooting and their tips for just what alternative crops are thriving here, which like it a little too much and you might not want to put in your garden because they'll take over, and everything in between. And that includes recipes and culinary preparations too. So yeah, it's all about
that's super cool.
It's really about flexibility when you grow in an extreme climate. Sometimes it's worth it to put in that extra effort to put a greenhouse in so you can have a tomato up north, or to get on an organic, pest hand removal regimen to make sure that you get that squash or that watermelon that you really want. And then other times it's just time to throw in the towel and say, like, I want that texture or that flavor that I'm looking for, but I'm willing to try an actual different crop just to replace it, and something that actually is happy in my climate.
Yeah, that's like a really fun thing. It can be frustrating, of course, but it is also fun when you are able to find something that you do really enjoy and that you could pull off really easily. Like, that's always a really nice little bonus there to kind of add in. So do you have any fruit substitute, in terms of fruiting summer crops, what are you kind of subbing in?
For the summertime, I give up on lettuces and European style lettuce and spinach, I swap over to my heat tolerant crops, to my heat tolerant lettuce and spinach. Things like sisu and edible leaf hibiscus are my top two for heat tolerant greens. Like I said, my sweet peppers, my red green peppers aren't really happening in the heat of summer, so I'll do no polys cactus. Edible gourds are a fantastic swap for those more sensitive cucurbits. Tomatoes, now I don't have I really wish that I had an answer for how to get the texture, flavor, and the sheer brilliance of a tomato in the summer in Florida. The closest thing I can offer is the Everglades tomato, which is a very, very small variety of tomato. It's literally like the size of smaller than a shooter marble, but it's about the size of a small marble.
Is that the wild, the original tomato, the Pimpinolum, or?
So I have yet to completely determine if it is Solanum pimpinifolium or if it's Solanum lepersicum. I can't remember. I think I knew that once, and I can't remember right now. But it is very similar to Solanum pimpinifolium, if it's not that.
Kevin grew those last year, and they were really tasty, but man, they are truly teeny.
Yeah, they're very small.
You'd have to cut up 50 of those to make a sandwich.
Yes. And they are so prolific here, even in the hot months, that you can be shaking those fruits down, and you can make a little batch of sauce. But that's probably the closest. The tomatoes, that one is kind of a white whale for me. If I could really, think of a way to replace the tomato. But you could also look at it from the perspective of a northern gardener who doesn't have tomatoes in the winter, where you're canning,
Yeah, totally.
blanching, and freezing to meet that need. So there are ways to get around it. At least tomatoes take well to canning and freezing, so we have that option.
Yeah, I personally really like the freezing of the tomatoes just because
Yes.
I don't have to do anything. I just throw them in the freezer and just use them before the next season and whatever. Like, it's fine.
Yep.
It's just so
Yeah,
convenient.
I kind of pivoted away from canning when I left New England. New England, our fall is pretty lovely, so it's a great time of year to start heading inside or to your outdoor kitchen and canning. But when I moved to the South, I was like, it's way too hot to be standing over a hot water canning bath. I'm not doing that.
I'm trying to get steamed over here.
Yeah, so I switched to freezing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. And then one thing you mentioned is the idea of the food forest. Is that like, how would you describe a food forest versus like what maybe a standard garden space would be? Like, I know there isn't a standard one, but
Sure. No, yeah. I mean, the best way to think of it is because I do like to make a pretty distinct pivot from my cool, temperate gardening season to my extreme heat summer season. And that pivot includes physically changing my location of where I'm growing my stuff. Because I predominantly grow in the cooler season, which would be the shoulder season, the spring, the fall, and of course the beloved Florida winter. That is where I'm really spending a lot of time in my raised bed gardens. I have like metal birdie beds, or I've got raised bed gardens, and that's where I'm growing my traditional, quote, quote, European style crops that you know, those are the things you're picking out from your seed catalog, your annual tender vegetables.
Yeah.
That's where that happens. And then once the extreme starts setting in of my summertime, that's when I'm eating and spending most of my time in the food forest. And that is more of a permanent installation. Crops that are more of the perennial type vegetables, edible perennial vegetables, edible perennial fruits, crops that I'm not going to have to constantly be seeding and tending. But the kind
you don't have to actively manage as much.
Yeah, we are creating a bit of a food forest design where we have an upper layer. You know, I have an ever-bearing mulberry. It's a beautiful mulberry tree on our property, and bananas. That's kind of like my top story. And then like mid-tier, we have things like the edible leaf hibiscus it's related to okra, so it gets about 6 feet tall. Yeah. So that's kind of my middle story. Also, that's where a lot of the fun fruits come in. My husband is really into rare fruit, and he collects lots of rare fruit trees. So your middle story could include something, especially because it loves shade, like the miracleberry tree. That's the one that changes your taste perception. Or the jaboticaba. Jaboticaba is known as like a Brazilian grape, and those trees do really well here in Florida. They love some shade, so they're great in the mid-story, and they're highly coveted because they're like really gourmet, delicious eating. And then
I've seen them. They're like fantastic. They look crazy. It's like these giant orbs just forming on the trunk of the tree.
Correct.
And I haven't yet had one. I had like mangosteen and stuff like that, but I haven't had a jaboticaba yet.
Yes, what you're describing is called caulifery, and it's when the flower is born directly on the stem of the tree. And that is what, jaboticaba have.
It looks really cool.
Yeah, cacao trees are the same way. They bear right on the stem. That's right. Super interesting to look at. If you're listening, just Google jaboticaba cauliflory or just jaboticaba tree, and you'll see. So they're a marvel to see. You do have to fight the squirrels for them here, but worth growing. That's your mid story, and then something on the under story would be like on the periphery where I'm getting good sun. I might put some some Everglades tomatoes, and honestly, they're kind of sprawly, bushy. I don't even really trellis them up, and they're fine. They don't really need. They could be trellised. But if you don't, that's fine. They really have more of a wild habit. And then things like sisu spinach, which is a very heat-tolerant spinach. That's another one that would hang out on my understory because it's very low growing. And so that's sort of where we're sort of replicating a forest design. We're working with what the plant likes. Am I a tall plant and I need full sun? I'm on the overstory. Am I chilling in the shade?
That's cool.
And So it's designed in that manner, and it's really so much more hands-off. And I'm very pregnant right now. It's kind of hard to tell because I'm wearing a black shirt, but I'm due like next week. So all summer I was very close. So all summer I was so relieved that I could spend my time gardening in the food forest rather than in the full sun of my raised bed garden where I like to spend my winters. Instead, I was under the shade of a mulberry tree, tucking little crops into their place, and there's not a lot of upkeep with a food forest. They're kind of self-sustaining once they get established.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting, especially I guess the one thing that a lot of places don't have that you do have is that option to grow a lot of these like really cool, unique tropical plants outside. And speaking of mulberry tree, there's a mulberry tree over here. And it's amazing how cooling these trees are. They're like nature's air conditioning, just being around them.
Yes.
It's like 20 degrees cooler. So I'm sure that was really nice to have in your food forest. But that's like it's really cool to think about how you have like these we call them like two seasons where you have your food forest season that is kind of a little bit more chill, which is like also the worst time of the year to garden. And like it's the worst and the best, right? Because most of us are looking forward to our summer crops, but nobody's looking forward to sweating and being assaulted by mosquitoes and bugs and stuff.
Yeah.
But that's the game, right? And then you have what I think is the best season, which are the shoulder seasons in San Diego as well, which are really kind of here, I would say like almost magical because they're so relaxed. Like it's not hot, it's warm enough for plants to grow. The pest pressure is kind of gone. Diseases aren't really a problem as much. And it's just like, and then you get to do your normal gardening season then. So it's interesting just to hear the differences between two places that have the same zone, but we live in entirely different worlds when it comes to gardening on its own.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're really, they don't have much in common except like probably how possibly cold they possibly can get on their coldest night and and sort of I can't even actually, if I conjure it, I can't remember the parameters of how they determine those USDA zones right at this very moment. But yes, and I'm not sure, I'd love to hear on your end, but I wanted to share with folks a very important resource for Florida gardeners is the University of Florida IFAS. They put out a monthly gardening calendar. It's an infographic. All you have to type into your search bar would be UF monthly planting calendar, and what will come up is each month they have broken down between North, Central, and South Florida what you should be planting at what time, and it's a pretty comprehensive guide that does include those alternative crops that I mentioned, as well as the European style crops that we're more familiar with, that some gardeners are more familiar with. So that is a great cheat sheet and pretty essential, especially if you're new to gardening or new to Florida, because I would have never guessed that I needed to start my tomatoes in August when I first moved here. So
yeah, it's like, how would you know?
It's a really essential resource. And I'm curious if California, because you are the #1 horticulture state, I mean, I think Florida maybe 2 or 3, and that's kind of why we have so many great resources through the university system, is that there's a lot of production here. But I'm curious if in California you have something similar.
So there is, I'll say in general, depending on wherever you guys who are listening live, a lot of states, and especially a lot of universities and states, have dedicated gardening horticulture pages. I run into them all the time when I'm doing research, and a lot of them are very regionally. Like Minnesota has like a great program because I always run into their stuff. So like look around for your region for sure. But speaking on California, it's interesting because yes, we are like #1 in agriculture, and what's crazy though is just how varied the microclimates are from where I am in San Diego all the way up to like Eureka, Arcata. And then you go east into the mountains, and then you have like Central Valley, the deserts, the high deserts. It's really like almost every single zone basically exists here. There's even like subtropical like kind of areas. So it's hard to get the general advice, but the UC system does have like full IPM, like integrated pest management information for different pests. They have like best practices for like orchard care for most plants. but it is kind of like generalized to California rather than being more specific about dates and times. At that point, I usually will lean to like the San Diego Master Gardeners, for example, has like
Right.
a page. And for San Diego, we're generally split up as coastal and inland. And our summer and winter seasons will be like 2 months offset from each other. So
Oh,
coastal will be much cooler. So I could start like my broccoli now. In fact, I already started some like last month, whereas somebody inland isn't going to really be starting till like the end of this month. So
that's
it's like
incredible. That's
it's
just
just
within
really
San
varied.
Diego. That's a huge
Just within San
vary.
Diego. And it could be
Wow.
within like 5 miles from each other. So it gets hard. Yeah, like literally, like no exaggeration.
Wow.
Even 3 miles if you're like up the mountain relative to the
Wow.
coast. Like there's just a lot of topography, so it
Mm-hmm.
creates a lot of different microclimates, which is also why I think we have the most farms. And it's also
Uh-huh.
like we also have like some of the highest bird populations and species
Oh.
diversity and stuff like that because of all this difference. And it it's really fun, but it can be a little bit of trial and error. Like the nice thing with San Diego is that even if you have an error, you generally have a lot of forgiveness because our climate is so kind of smoothed out in terms of extremes that there's a lot of flexibility, which I definitely appreciate because I'm not a very good planner. I like to pretend to make plans, but really I just kind of fly and I'm just I'm just going grab my seed box. I'm like, let's start this right now.
Same
This
here.
is like
Same here.
roughly the time I would do this, but I don't really have like set time windows or anything like that. But there's tons of great resources out there. And I think it's also like part of the value that Kevin and I will bring is we're talking about our experiences, what we're doing, like what we see, what we've experienced, why we do this. When I do my seed starting videos, like they'll be 30 to 40 minutes long because I'll be starting seeds on like, this is a really great broccoli for these reasons. It does really well in this climate. It does really good side shoot production, which is great if it's really hot because then you also like lose your main head. So it's all about these like little trade-offs and balances. And it's just fun to experience them and try them out for yourself. It's one of the things I'll always tell somebody is if somewhere says that you can't grow that plant, but you really want to, try it. There's a good chance like you can make it work. Like there's some things that are just not going to happen, right? Like you're not going to grow oranges outdoors in Minnesota because it's just physically not possible. But there are, you could try to make it work, put it in a container, bring it inside your garage. There's always a way
Yeah.
to kind of force something. Sometimes it's not worth it, but I encourage everyone to try, especially if it's something you're really excited to grow, because that's why we're doing it. Like I'm growing because I love to eat, but I love to do it, and I love the plants that I'm growing. And I don't want somebody to think that they can't get in there because somebody said that plant doesn't grow there. It's all
Yep.
about experimenting and trying it out. And you will fail sometimes, and some things aren't going to be possible. But then maybe you'll find like a cool alternative along the way. So
Yeah. You
that's
do have to
it's
have
just
that
kind of this
passionate
game.
approach. Yeah, that's a really
Yeah,
great point. That's a great point. Yeah, you have to
but
have that passionate approach, and that is how you learn.
yeah, and mistakes are fine. Like mistakes
Hmm.
are like the best way to learn, right? So
And I mean,
and,
like,
and
there
the
had
garden
to
gives us plenty
be.
of opportunities.
I mean, the greenhouse was invented for a reason because there was some lunatic who was like, I need a pineapple and I need it in
Yeah,
winter up north. So somebody did it once and that's how it
yeah,
happened. So,
totally. Yeah. Well, it's been super fun chatting, Shanny. I feel like we could probably keep talking about things for hours. So maybe we'll pick it up again and have another conversation because this was really fun. And I think we only scratched the surface of a lot of these topics. I'm really
absolutely.
excited to see more of you on like that Big Gardening channel and seeing your
Mhm.
content because I love your approach to things and I love the way you talk and think about things and how excited you are. So it's been really fun chatting with you today, and I'm sure everyone really enjoyed it as well.
Oh, thank you for having me. I had a blast.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And maybe we'll get to meet each other sometime soon. And
Yeah.
good luck with the baby.
Thank you.